Well, hi everybody, Dave Cross here. So here's my first video. I figured I'd go ahead and throw one out there today, and we'll go ahead and take care of all the prerequisites we're going to need for some of these videos that we're dealing with IP control, i.e. the IP address management tool and the REST APIs that we're going to go through for these examples. So I guess the first thing we need to have is first an IP control executive, and we're going to need versions either 8, 9, or 10. I am in this demo going to be working with version 10, and really the differences between the three versions are version 8 is going to use a simple basic authentication methodology, and versions 9 and 10 of IP control use a JWT token. So I'm going to use IP control 10. I'm going to show you the token process and some of the utilities there. So the first thing we want to make sure of is that we have a working IP control executive, that you have administrative permission to some type of access within the IP control instance. So you'll need to have some type of GUI access, and at least somewhere within the application that your permissions will allow you to add, delete, modify, and do kind of custom things. And I'm going to recommend either you do this in a lab system. Don't do this on your production unless you're ready to go to production. Do it on a lab system, and or give us a call, and we can give you a evaluation key or look up something from that point. So from the administrative permissions, we need to have a level that's going to give you some view. Set up your database that you have at least a container and a network and subnet. And I think we need to use some of your assumed capabilities, at least within your IP control database. Right. So just having that kind of capability. And if you're using 10.0, what we need to make sure of in the administrative interface, select your administrator. Mine will be TAC login in this case. And in the policies tab, we need to ensure that both the web UI and the CLI interface are both enabled. And the reason being, we want to log in to validate the data to confirm some of the APIs. And we also need to have the CLI, which is effectively the API enablement as well. The rest of these changes can be administrator preferences based on your company and organization and or lab. So checking duplicate host names and whether those are host only or fully qualified. Right. So prerequisite for the administrator, we need to have at least that type of access and at least somewhere within the application that you have add, read, write, delete permission. Okay. Now, the administrative tools that we're going to use, one of the interfaces that's new to IP control and starting with 8.0 and advancing through, is the Swagger documentation tool we use to document the new RESTful APIs. And the RESTful APIs, if you are familiar or even not, use a JSON, which is JavaScript object notation, kind of plain text, comma, or a colon value type structures. So very easy to work with when considering working with SOAP XML, which was the alternative. So if you are a SOAP XML developer, like I have done some in the past, this is a whole new day for development moving to REST, and much easier to work with, rapid deployment and prototyping. And we're going to get some videos that are going to show some new technology we have using Node-RED and other capabilities that will impress you, I think, from that endpoint perspective. A lot of talking there. So let's get into the Swagger here and kind of what it's doing. The Swagger interface is HTTPS only. Your URL is your executive. If you're running locally, and regardless, locally or remote, you're most likely using port 8443, which is a default, so ensure that. Then your URL is inc-rest/API/docs, index.html. That will load your default screen, which will show you effectively the Swagger interface, where you can then authenticate to your user and we can start accessing the APIs and working through the examples. So let's go ahead and just log in real quick here too, and then we get to the other functions. I'll show you a few other requirements. So again, I'm going to use TAC login, which is my user here, and I'm going to have to expose this password later. So I'm going to use something I'm going to change when I go into production. So do the same and use something that you don't mind people seeing if you're sharing. So the first thing is, in IP control and using the REST APIs, and specifically with IP control 9 and 10, we have a new login function which effectively initiates a token based on the authentication success of our administrator that we are going to use as we call other APIs. And this token is going to be defined into each of the API calls into the authentication or authorization bearer header, and it needs to be passed for each API subsequent call. You can generate a new call or new token every time, or if you expect to be within an interactive shell or long-term sessions or multiple sessions, that shell and token is available for an hour. So it defaults to 3,600 seconds, which should be sufficient for most transactions, I hope. Now, in terms of the login, specifically what we're looking for here and what Swagger is going to help us do is to test the functionality, and it points out to us the various endpoints, which this then will translate into a endpoint, API endpoint that we will call in our different scripting languages like Postman, or I'm going to use curl since that's what the example will be here, and then other programming structures. So login is the API endpoint. We don't need to know that at this point, but you'll see it here shortly. And then from a input, many of these fields that require input values for getting data are going to prompt you for those fields they require. And then others that are going to be filter-based, like exporting or importing, will use full JSON data, which you'll supply within the API call itself. And you'll see that example. So here I'm just going to put into an input field, and we're going to type in our password here. But what we hope to see here from our authentication is that it's going to show us a status. It should tell us what we should see, and then any kind of error codes that we should see. But more importantly, it's going to provide us details such as the curl syntax and using the authorization bearer header built in that is going to allow us to make an API in the shell. So we're going to be able to just simply copy and paste that, and that's going to help us create an API here. So then in the REST request URL, this then exposes what the actual endpoint is that your calling scripting language or programs will call. So say from curl, this is the endpoint login, posting data into it. That is going to then be our username password, which should give us back a token, which subsequently we'll use for further calling. Okay, so it's kind of a two-step process, login and then your subsequent API calls. Now in the Swagger itself, just while we're here, it should show you the current API call response and then any of the response headers. So it's very helpful for helping us determine the capabilities and what's required for this function. Okay, so now the second thing I want to do is, and while we're here, and just kind of what this example will be, and it's typically the simplest example we have every day we get requests, and that is that somebody wants a new IP address and they want to be able to assign the next available. They know what the subnet is, or maybe they don't, but they do know where they need to assign it, and they just want the next available for a server. So there's a few things that we have within this structure that we can show in examples here, and two specific APIs that I'm going to kind of walk through. The first of those APIs is what we call the useNextReserved IP address, which effectively makes a call into the database. It looks for a reserved range of addresses, so when an actual status of reserved, takes one, converts it to a static, and then we use that for the IP address. And it has a couple limitations because it's designed to do a quick assign without having all of the details available. So we can effectively use this API as one method, but I want to use something a little bit different, and I want to use the import device because it gives us a little bit more flexibility in how the IP is assigned, and it gives us some conditional and flow controls over where in the subnet it's going to look for the next available address and assign that back to the administrator. And more importantly, from the beginning or end of the subnet is really the policy that we're going to use here. Okay, but while we're here, a couple other things that you'll see, and we're going to pull some of this details even, and I'm going to use this, kind of as the example, is that we have a get function that allows us to get a device with the IP address. Now, the reason I want to do this is it gives me an example of what the JSON looks like that I'm later going to use for the import format. So let's just see if I have something here defined. And for special note here, and I don't think I need this in my example, but if you're using overlapping address space, meaning you have subnets of the same subnet address, just stored in different containers in IPControl, it is necessary to have the container name for that subnet address. So we need to know what the container is that this subnet is organized in. If it's not the case and you don't have the allow overlapping checkbox assigned on any of your blocks that are considered to be a root block, then you're okay. But if it says overlapping block, chances are it's a duplicate and you'll need to have the container, right? I don't in this one particular case, so I'm gonna leave that there. But something that is of value to look at. And what I hope to find, and I have, is an actual IP address then that is in the structure we refer to as a WS device, web service device, kind of carried over from the SOAP XML days. But it is also the JSON we need to import an IP address with the descriptive names and field examples that we can modify for our test example. Okay, so we're going to do two things. I'm going to copy the body of this, and then I want to navigate back up to the device APIs, and I want to look specifically for the import device, which then shows me what the structure looks like. And one thing to note that I need to have in this structure is I need to have an INP device structure wrapper around the JSON that I'm going to paste into it. So first thing I need to do here is I need to go ahead and just type this in that structure. I'm going to leave that opening bracket off. I'm going to go ahead and paste. That'll give me all of the JSON, and I'm going to close that structure with the opening input device. So what I should have now is the full device structure that I can now manipulate for my test and for this example. So here, the first thing is I don't need to have the address type as interface. I want to set this up as static to tell it the address type, to make it a static IP address. I don't have any aliases defined, but if I wanted to define a DNS alias, I can insert it into an array, a string array. So I could say that this is www1 that I'll use for my host. The container, I'm going to go ahead and keep that because I'm going to use the same subnet for this. And then from the description, I'll just say API enabled or API added. And lastly, I need to have the type of device, and I really want to use server because this is going to be one of my servers. And I'm going to do a couple things here. The first time, I'm going to do apply naming policy, which is going to look at a predefined naming policy for the server type, and it's going to auto-create that name. So I don't really know what my server name is at this point. I just want the address, but later I'm going to come back and modify it. And so I'm going to go ahead and do that. Now I'm going to remove the ID. We don't need the ID, but if we're going to do any kind of modification to, say, an IP device or something later, we will. And the rest of the information, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the interfaces. We're going to do a single IP address interface. And I effectively want to remove everything down to this comma. Actually, I want to remove that comma even and leave the IP address. And I want to change the IP address to be the subnet. And I want this conditionally to assign the next available from the end of the subnet, working its way downward in the lowest bit. So highest bit to low bit. And so this, I think, should create an IP device, create a name, assign an alias as a static device for server in this subnet. And what I should get in return is effectively an IP address. The curl equivalent to this then generates all of the necessary curl and fields, which now can become a template for whatever other APIs you need to create and filling these in with variables that are more interactive or responsive. And as we see here, now I have just a simple result so that when my scripting language processes this, I'm going to have just the IP address, and we might want to do something with that later. So what I could do now, as an example, and even through the APIs, is model this to get that IP address and to pull out all the details. So we could then go back to the get IP by IP adder, type in the new or enter the new address, get rid of any extraneous characters, and hit try it out, and that should then pull back all of the structure. So if you need to pull these additional details, you could. All right, so we're going to now, I guess, take a look at putting this into a real simple shell script that we're going to call that's going to allow us to log in and allow us to pass on a variable our login name, effectively the subnet address that we want, and the device type, and then have it auto-generate the name for us, or IP address for us. Okay, and we're going to use curl to do that, so we're going to use examples provided. So I guess first of all, I have a shell window here, and I have some examples that I've been working on. And I think we'll go ahead and start here and just kind of look at this first. So the first thing is, and I recommend doing this, is to separate your logins and the login APIs from your subsequent calls. And then just include that functionality within your scripts, calling it, creating a variable, and then passing it to your internal script. So one recommendation is to have a separate login. The second recommendation is that you don't deal with passwords at all, which I'm not going to here. I have a password in a file that I'm just simply going to cat into this, but you really should consider about setting up authentication, file permissions and rights, and defining a user that only it can look at this file for a hashed password, and potentially some way of unhashing that to secure it even more. So quite a few options and capabilities there that you should consider in addition to this. Now, what this is going to do for us, and it simply is, I'm going to call this curl script, and I've copied it from the login function that we had in curl. So this is in its entirety the login API with very little modification just for the variables. So now let's go back to the login, and you could simply, in this response, in the curl, copy and paste this line, and we could copy that into a shell script and use that as the actual command. Okay. Let's just open another terminal. Okay, now because this is shell, I'm going to go ahead and just start my opening script tags and go ahead and paste this. Now, I think this should do everything I need it to do, although this has the authorization bearer in it. I can go ahead and take that out, which I will do, so that we're actually calling the command we need to log in, since we're not going to have this initially when we perform the login. Okay, so let's just go ahead and grab this all the way down to the -D. All right, coming up here. Okay. Now, all right, and then this we want to pass in our username, which we're going to take out of here. As a string, and then we're going to go back to and the last part of this should be our endpoint. Now the endpoint is mostly, and should be correct. I do recall though back in the earlier days of this that the port would be missing. Port's very important if you're using a non-standard port, which we do in most cases. So make sure that's set. And I need to make sure I'm doing PSWD. And I'm just going to cat home pwd, which is my test password file. Now, if that everything is looking good and my quotes and end quotes are looking right, I should be able to make that executable by my user. Now we should get, okay, I forgot. So we need to now add one thing that's not in there. We need to add a skip of the security checks for the certificate, unless you're going to pass that directly or explicitly. And that is -K, which we should be able to run that again and verify that. Okay, and we should get unauthorized. So now if we go in and do our login, I have my token. So we have effectively just created a script API that calls that token So now we know that works and we can use this moving forward. Now, what do you do with the token and how do you pull this out of there? Everyone's going to have different development tools and options. I've read and found and agreed with the articles I found for using JQ. So JQ is a way to work with this text. As an example, I'll just do JQ and you'll see it highlighted a little bit different, but it parses JSON at the shell level and allows us to work with that information. So now I can say JQ from the root of the JSON, give me the access token, which is the object name. And it then pulls out this token. So now in my scripts, I can pull the token, log in, pull the token, and then create the next step, which would be assigning the IP address. Okay. So we've got our test login. And now what we want to do is we want to create a curl script that calls that login and then one that also allows us to call the other APIs to assign the next available IP. So 1 second. Okay, so I wanted to get this file set up first before going through the time, because I already had these token headers and so forth already defined. So basically what we have here, I set up a variable that goes out and is going to call that new test login script that we just created. And it's going to extract through that JQ command the access token, and then it's going to create and strip out all the extraneous characters so that we can use it moving forward. So what I need to do here is call this test login. And we want to pass that our variable. Let's just verify this real quick. Okay. Okay, I think I see what we got here. So I think I had the user wrong. So let's see again. Add next IP. So we shouldn't have anything. And then if I add my login, which I have my password file for, okay, should get that. So now in our add next IP, we're effectively going to use this same header. So I'm going to just simply copy this because this is going to be used for almost everything we do with an import. So it's good to have, and you can just kind of template that again in your scripts. And so now that should open our device. And then what we want to do is go back into our import device that we did the example. And we want to copy that JSON structure. Because we know this works, and that is effectively the minimum we need, less the opening bracket with the ending bracket. So now if we run this command again, add next, we're going to pass it in our login. It's going to pull it out of our password file for the password authentication. And then we want to specify the subnet. And I'm going to use the same. This is going to give me the address. So there's a quick API, and you can modify this file a little to pass in other variables. Just making sure that you close the single quote, because it is open with a single quote here. Close it, add your variable, and then open it back up again. And you should be able to pass things in like device types, whether you want to do reserved on the status type, or even things like manual DHCP. So that's a real quick rundown, I hope, of setting up the IP address and running a real simple script. Hope to help you. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments, or if anything you want me to go through in more detail, and I can go and build something further out there. So my next video, I do want to kind of expand on this idea a little bit, looking at other types of ads like subnets, and then we'll get into sites and all those kind of great capabilities. But a good introductory, and hope it helps. Thanks.